to the Mission Critical Insight series. Today, we are privileged to be joined by Mark Montgomery to discuss recognizing the criticality of infrastructure. A short intro to Mission Critical. Mission Critical facilitates collaboration between academia, industry, and government to develop interdisciplinary, actionable, and peer-reviewed research focused on improving critical infrastructure, security, and resilience. My name is Joyce Hunter, and I am Mission Critical's Executive Director for Collaboration and Education. I have previously served as both the interim CIO and deputy CIO for policy and planning for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and held other senior leadership roles within the federal government, ICIT, Lotus Development Corporation, Lawson Software, and Computer Sciences Corporation. I'd like to introduce you to Mark Montgomery. Mark serves as the Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, where he leads Foundation for Defense of Democracy's efforts to advance U.S. prosperity and security through technology innovation while countering cyber threats that seek to diminish them. Mark also directs CSC 2.0, an initiative that works to implement the recommendations of the congressionally mandated Cyber Solarium, where he served as the executive director. Mark previously served as policy director for the Senate Arms Committee under the leadership of Senator John McCain, coordinating policy efforts on national security and capabilities requirements and cyber policy. All opinions here are those of Mark Montgomery's and do not reflect those of the Foundation for Defense Democracy. Welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us, and it's exciting to discuss and share your unique perspective on critical infrastructure security and resilience.
Thank you very much for having me, Joyce, and it's a real pleasure to be here on Mission Critical with you. I look forward to a robust Q&A.
Great. Let's dig right into it. How infrastructures are classified, secured, and discussed are at the core of Mission Critical. You have been a prolific voice in critical infrastructure and government for many years. So Mission Critical wanted to take this opportunity for you to share your perspectives on past, current, and future critical infrastructure within our audience. We'd like to start with these critical infrastructure interviews with some level setting for our multi-stakeholder audience. So with that in mind, would you mind very generally defining critical infrastructure and its importance for our audience?
Well, thanks. Yeah, that's important. So look, I look at critical infrastructure as the accumulation of assets, utilities, businesses, functions, sometimes done by state and local government, sometimes done by private companies, sometimes done by the federal government, but they collectively provide a sector capability, whether it's electricity, rail transportation, aviation transportation, ports transportation, water. I mean, you go through, there's 16 critical infrastructure sectors and probably another 7 or 8 really significant subsectors. What they do is they're organized in order to improve our national security, economic productivity, and or public health and safety. Some sectors cut across all 3, some across just 1 or 2. But when I look at them, they are both, they're a physical attribution, but also they're a network cyber system. So there's both a physical and cyber security implication to each of these sectors. And one last thing I say that's unique about them is they are things that are under duress now, under duress from criminal actors, but also under duress from nation states. That nation state issue is unique. You know, historically, when a nation state wanted to threaten the United States, they would use submarines, aircraft, tanks, whatever it is. And those things are, it's pretty easy. If I think to myself, boy, someone out there has got to do some anti-submarine warfare. I didn't look like to the Department of Transportation. I didn't look like to Southern Company. I instead looked at the U.S. Navy as part of the Department of Defense. So very uniquely in most warfare areas for decades now, the principal actor has been the Department of Defense. That's not true in the cybersecurity protection of our critical infrastructures because they are 85% owned and operated by either the private sector or state and local governments. people who don't have a
Mm.
traditional role in the in nation state, war fighting or crisis response. So to me, that's the big picture of critical infrastructures.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your answer. So, when you look at it, on the second part, um, what are you, if the NIPP were to be updated again, and just for those people who don't know what the NIPP is, it's the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. Uh, if it was to be updated again, which areas do you think would be mature or distinct enough to be considered their own sectors?
Yeah, thanks. So you're right. We just finished an update, the National Security Memorandum 22, which updated Presidential Policy Directive 21, which was signed in 2013. So these documents are what kind of describe how the government's organized to do critical infrastructure protection, both cyber and physical security that's involved in that. The fact that we let it go 10 years or 11 years really between updates was not not smart. And certainly myself and others like Frank Salifo and some Senator King, Representative Garbarino, so across the aisle, both chambers have been critical of the Biden administration and by association the Trump administration for not updating these documents. But we finally updated the document that guides our critical infrastructure protection organization and execution in this spring in 2024. And as part of it, you're absolutely right. It said, hey, look, it renamed the National Infrastructure Protection Plans, the National Risk Management Plans. It says CISA will do a broad national risk management plan, and then each sector will write a sector risk management plan.
Mm.
And these will replace documents that are from 2015, which again, way too old. These things are 9 years old.
Yeah.
We can all understand that the cyber risk, I mean, ransomware barely existed, didn't really exist 9 years ago. CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, didn't exist 9 years ago. So, these things were woefully out of date. The vast majority of the sector plans were cut and paste jobs from each other. So they weren't very unique. But the National Infrastructure Protection Plan will now be replaced by a National Risk Management Plan. I actually think that's a really good thing. Here's the problem, though, Joyce. They had to give CISA 2 years. So in the NSM 22, they came out and said, get this done in 2 years. So we're not going to see that until 2026, maybe late 2025, the National Risk Management Plan. That's way too late. That makes the current plan, 10, 11 years old, when it finally
Mm-hmm.
gets replaced. Again, this all goes back to being too slow to update to produce NSM 22. It should have been produced in the first year of the administration. Okay, so to get to your question, we now set it up. You're gonna have this that the NSM itself is what says, hey, what are the sectors? And NSM 22 did a good job in describing risk management, did a good job in updating for all the changes that have happened. Where it did a poor job was it refused to acknowledge, to change the critical infrastructures. And so
Mm-hmm.
it said basically what we had, kind of how we had it pegged 11 years ago with one minor change, which was or two minor changes. One was to get rid of national parks as a critical infrastructure, and the second was to kind of add in, to acknowledge election security as a subsector. What it failed to do was acknowledge that two big changes have happened. One is in just how we transfer and protect and secure data and how important that data is to each of the other infrastructures. So despite the fact that like Microsoft Brad Smith has said, hey, cloud is a critical infrastructure, we did not name cloud as a critical infrastructure. We didn't even name it as a specific subsector with kind of like special qualities that go with being a designator and named subsector for the ITC, information technology and communications sector. So we did not highlight cloud, despite the fact that almost all of us understand cloud is both the challenge and the risk, going forward on how we protect, secure, and properly, effectively utilize and profit from data. So that's the first error, not acknowledging cloud. As a result, cloud doesn't have a sector coordinating council, it doesn't have a government coordinating council, it doesn't have an SR, sector risk management agency with very specific responsibilities. It's very hard to hold them accountable for what's happening,
Mm-hmm.
the cloud service providers
Mm-hmm.
and the cloud computing industry. That was number one. Number two was space. Space has evolved dramatically in the last 10, 11 years. It's gone from being effectively a government business to a private sector business. Today, 80% of all the satellites that are up in the air are government owned and operated. However, 80% of what's being launched each year, maybe even higher now, is private sector. There's a complete flip-flop occurring where what's up in the air is going to be predominantly private sector very soon. I mean, Starlink alone, I think, has 6,000 satellites up there in the low Earth orbit. So, and they've got 12 or 13 competitors in the low Earth orbit communications business. So there's this flip-flop happening. There's now the ability to economically exploit space, whether it's getting minerals from the moon or getting minerals from
Mhm.
asteroids or other objects passing through, meteors passing around. There's definitely an economic game here. And it is, from my perspective, it is an area that absolutely, and it's at risk, right? If
Yeah,
it's a known
yeah.
target set for Chinese or Russian or maybe even American, cyber and physical operators during wartime. My point on this is clearly space had become its own sector, but really for all the wrong reasons, which is, DOD was like, hey, stay clear of me. The intelligence community was like, hey, stay clear of me. And they do that often in sectors, I get it. But in this case, it had an overbearing effect. And both Commerce and NASA, one of those two agencies should have stood up and said, we will be the sector risk management agency. We will lead this effort. My
Mhm.
personal recommendation is NASA. I think when the director of NASA wakes up in the morning, he thinks or she thinks space, 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 space. When the Secretary of Commerce wakes up in the morning, she thinks chips, 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 chips. I'd rather have the person taking space be in charge. Bottom line is, no one's in charge.
Ah,
And when no one's in charge, it's very hard for the private sector to work with the government. When they can go four different
mhm,
places for four different answers, that's a problem. We're seeing this. There's also a lack of prioritization. We're seeing this in I'll just go on a slight tangent here and say there's this big issue with GPS. The L1
mhm,
frequency is very jammable. We're seeing that in Ukraine. It's old. It's less accurate. It's less effective. And the satellites themselves are aging. So we've been launching replacement satellites with what's called an L5 frequency, a better frequency than the GPS. They're called the GPS-3 architecture. And
mhm.
we need to launch a couple more satellites to get a full architecture up, a successful, healthy architecture up. The military doesn't need this as much as the private sector. Your tractor combines need this, your ports need it, your rail system needs it, your aviation system needs it. They all the electrical power grid needs it. Everybody needs this timing signal and this GPS signal. I mean, we're at the point now where John Deere is about to put its own satellites up. I mean, we
Yes.
100% have this GPS reliance. All right. So that being said, the military, because of some classified systems, is in a better place. So is Space Force prioritizing the launch of the L5s to get the private sector up to speed? No, because in their mind, it's not. They don't have big enough a vision to understand that all these all these other critical infrastructures really matter to the military. They just look
Mhm.
at what's the military want, what's the intelligence community 1, 2, 3, and they're doing their launching, and they're not letting this in.
Yeah.
So my point on this is, if we'd had a sector risk management agency to help push and prioritize and get Space Force into the right spot, I don't think Space Force is knowingly, unwittingly stupid. I think they're accidentally stupid in this case. And we need to get those L5 satellites up, and we should have gotten them up last year, frankly. And if not this year, and if not this year, next year. So that's a very long-winded answer to say NSM 22 is important, but it missed out on two critical infrastructures.
And I would have to agree with you, Mark. I think space is it's not only the final frontier, as Star Trek would say, but it is the frontier going forward into the not the unforeseeable future. And as far as John Deere is concerned, I know that they have entered a partnership with SpaceX to put their satellites in the air. And so, what do you think the farmers are already asking me? So, what does this mean? What does this mean for my data? How is it being protected? I don't want my data floating out there in space somewhere. So I think you're absolutely right that this has to be addressed because a lot of the stakeholders and participants in this area are really asking a lot of questions.
No, I agree
So,
completely. And look, when agriculture look, when agriculture is deep in space, we're all deep in space. So, I'm excited about about the modernization for agriculture. But you're absolutely right. With that modernization, with that reliance on space becomes cybersecurity risk, and we have to be accounting for it.
So, what, in your opinion, would be clear indicators of maturity to potential sector status in the future?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, this could have just happened. So look, here's what a sector really needs. It needs three things. It needs a private sector that's investing properly in its physical and cybersecurity. It needs a government agency tapped to be the sector risk management agency who analyzes risk, figures out how to mitigate risk, figures out, works with the private sector people I just mentioned with to have emergency response plans, incident response
Mhm,
plans.
mhm,
It works with CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, to make sure there's an effective exchange of threat information germane to that sector, which for some sectors may have to be instantaneous, like financial services or communications or energy. But for others like K through 12, could be slightly less than instantaneous. K through 12 education, which is the protection of our school districts. They don't probably have to be at the same speed of data exchanges as telecommunications, but pretty quick. They work with, and then once a casualty happens, they help mitigate, respond to and recover from. So that's the sector risk management agency. So first you have the sector, the sector risk management agency, and third, it's that relationship they have together. It's the infrastructure, it's the relationships, it's the sector coordinating council, which is private sector organization. The government coordinating council is the government organization, and there's a little bit of each in the other there. And there's the development, the support of ISACs, information
mhm,
sharing and analysis
mhm.
centers. It's creating the ecosystem of the sector to be successful. So if you have all three of those, which really only occurs in one or two of our sectors, I gently say one or two of our sectors are kind of B plus A minus players, and that's electricity or energy and financial services, and both of them happen to be highly regulated, which contributes to that.
Yeah,
But in
yeah.
addition, they've both been under attack for a long period of time, and therefore the companies themselves recognize the value in this regardless of regulation. Many other sectors have, of those three aspects, have zero, one, or two working. A
Mm,
number of them have zero of them working effectively. I'm fairly critical of water, agriculture and food, um, K through 12 education. I just feel in most of those cases, there's really, and then health and human service, health and healthcare providers, right? Hospitals and
mhm.
healthcare providers. I think all of those, and these are really the backbone of public health and safety.
Yeah.
They're in a tough position, all of them, and I really wouldn't give any of their three areas a grade above C. Most of them are D's and F's. So we really need to put a lot of focus there. So to me, that's those three factors that make for a successful sector.
Well, that leads me to the next question. So, are there any steps that can be taken by policymakers, agencies, private sector to secure better systems in developing these subsectors such as space and education, food and ag, where sector-wide governance might be difficult to retrofit and apply? But not only that, they just don't get the appropriations that the other agencies do.
Well, you hit right on it, Joyce. That's exactly it. So look, it's hard for me to imagine a sector dragging the government to the right answer, right? I mean, that's not historically how things happen. Um, every once in a while, you'll see like there's a leading edge. This energy's close to that. Um, so energy's close to that, and really that's the strength of leadership and the fact that for years our sector coordinating councils actually been populated by the CEOs, the chief executive officers of these major companies, and there's 7 or 8 major power companies in America that provide 70, 75, 80% of the distribution network. So they had a unique opportunity there. They had good leaders, a guy named Tom Fanning at Southern Company being
Mhm.
chief among them, who really led that, and Fred Furman at Berkshire Hathaway Energy, who really led the charge on that. Okay. So what's it really take? You hit right on it. It takes the sector being properly resourced to do the job. This it
Yeah.
We created sector, the SPP, sector agencies, sector specific agencies, SSAs, back in 1998 with PPD 63, Presidential District under the Clinton administration, and the National Infrastructure Assurance Plan in 2000. I helped write both of those, and we very clearly created these agencies. So they've had this job for 25 years. We actually passed a law in 20. We're so frustrated by their poor performance over the first 2 decades by the majority of these sector agencies, which are like federal agencies like Department of Agriculture, Department of Education, Department of
Mhm.
EPA, Department of Energy. We got so disappointed, we wrote a law. The law said, this is actually how you do it. We're going to rename you sector risk management agencies, and here's your actual 6 responsibilities. Even then, many of these federal agencies don't ask for the right level budget. And I'll give you an example. Department of Energy, was, as I said, does a good job. Has a $200 million department or agency within it called CSER, which is cybersecurity and emergency response actions in there. So it has a couple things in it, but a big chunk of this is cybersecurity, $200 million budget. The same type of agency at agriculture or Department of Education gets around $500,000, 250,000 to maybe $1 million. One of them, Department of Education, clearly has a $250,000 budget for this, which is what most of us in the government would know as one FTE, full-time equivalent human being, which is what it pays for. And then you go, so I'm saying 250,000, 100 million. Look, the answer is somewhere in between, but it's a lot closer to 100 million than it is to 250,000. And HHS, Health and Human Services, it's got the healthcare system under siege from ransomware for 2-3 years. They were creeping their budget up from like 2 million to 5 million to 7 million. They just, after the change incident, federal budgets came out like 2 weeks later. It suddenly got a bump, not to what they knew they needed. They knew they needed 25 million. That was their internal discussion. They actually funded, I want to say 15 or 7, 12 or 15 million. They're still way below need. And this is a federal agency supporting a sector under siege with people dying. We don't like to talk about this. It's critical infrastructure is not like cybersecurity is not like a bomb. It's hard to see the exact human killed, but we know from studies. And there's a guy named Josh Corman that's done from the cavalry and and he also worked at CISA, and he's doing some other work now. Has clearly, and others have clearly articulated that that ransomware events at major medical centers or rural medical centers lead to changes in morbidity. In other words, during the 2 weeks of a ransomware event and maybe 2 to 4 weeks after it, in a typical event, you can see a change in morbidity in that hospital. I can't tell you who specifically died, but I can tell you more people died. Now, look, people die in hospitals. We know that. But when a higher percentage die after an event, you can attribute to that event. Now, look, if my hospital is closed by ransomware and you're in an ambulance and you have to divert 40 miles away and you die en route, my family's got a pretty good lawsuit, right? Because it's definitely on you. These other ones, which is much more the case, these higher morbidity rates, right now there's not liability for it. There will be soon. And here's HHS lowballing their budgets on this. Anyway, I'll just tell you, it's exactly what you said. It's appropriations. When the federal agencies have the money they need to be good sector risk management agencies, they then can build the relationships, which is the next key thing, and the infrastructure, the GCCs, government coordinating councils, SECs, sector coordinating councils, supporting the ISACs, working with CISA, all that flows from resources. So get the resources right. That starts with the federal agencies and the president's budget, and it ends with Congress and the appropriations. But you can't ask Congress to fix a problem that's not properly identified for them by the president's budget.
When I was at Department of Agriculture, and they used to have regular meetings for the PMA, the President's Management Agenda, and the Deputy Secretary came back livid one afternoon because she was called out because our score was a D. And she said, so what are we going to do about it? And in time, we did get the score back up to an A. But the whole thing, Mark, is so are they still doing that? Are they still holding the deputy secretaries or the administrators accountable for their PMAs?
Yeah, so I think they're doing a good job on their own, like job monitoring their own networks. In other words, there's still grades that come out and then Congress backs it up with their own grading system, where they hire someone to grade. So on the down and in of an agency, you know, the job of a CISO, making sure that your own networks are secure, I think they do a good job. Where they're not getting the grading is what I just talked about, the up and out, the work with the federal, with the sector itself. I just think, you know, the good ones know they're good, the bad ones know they're bad, and you don't talk about Fight Club, right? You know, so I mean, there's just a little bit of, from my point of view, I don't think the federal government, you know, the federal government's not excited about saying we have 23 or so sectors and critical and important subsectors, and we have 3As and 14 Ds and 5Fs. You know, that's, we all know that no administration ever does that. All they do is talk about A's. So I think they'd much rather talk about I think this administration, Biden administration, has done a very good job, or a good job, improving the federal budgets for IT security, you know, for the security of federal networks. You know,
Mhm.
and OMB and the National Cyber Director have put focus on this. CISA has provided a lot of support to the smaller agencies. You can see measurable improvements. I get DoD on its own has done a significant job. So that one, I think, Joyce, you get the deputy secretary gets the briefing, and then once in a while
Mhm.
someone gets called out. Um,
Yeah.
the other one, the performance in, you know, your performance in secretary's management agency, I don't think that grade sheet's revealed. I think that's close hold,
Mhm.
classified.
Yeah, and like there's no real teeth to
Yeah,
FATARA,
yeah.
right? I mean, so you get red, yellow, green, and you know they get slapped on the wrist and they are marched in front of Representative Connolly, and that's it. You don't hear anything until the next quarter.
Well, and the other thing, just because I like to throw shade, the federal senior leadership council, you know, is keeping an eye on some of this stuff. These sector management, you know, this is like, I put it like, it's like in Star Wars, the Imperial Senate. You know, I mean, it is the ultimate rubber stamper of yes men. I mean, it's a series of 100. I don't know how many, 70 to 100, like senior executives. These are probably all fine Americans. I'm sure they are. The problem is trying to reach a consensus-based solution to things. This is how we end up, by the
Mhm.
way, with not having space or cloud as critical infrastructures. They left it to them. So you're not going to get 70 federal, you know, you're just not going to get this kind of bureaucracy to like make hard decisions. You don't look, I'm not for an authoritarian regime to make hard decisions, but in the end, there needs to be a decider. And the
Yeah.
decider is not a council of unnamed bureaucrats, right? It needs to be someone that can go forth to the press and say, I made this decision. We don't need spaces or critical infrastructure. I'd love to have that person. I'd respect that decision. I disagree with it, but you can't even find someone to disagree. They're like, well, you know, the bureaucracy, there's no one's accountable. You know, when 100 people are
Yeah.
responsible for something, no one's responsible for it.
Well, does confusion arise then when aspects of a sector are governed by multiple risk sector management agencies, like food and agriculture is overseen by both FDA and USDA?
But there's an opportunity for that. But I also want to make clear there's regulators and sector risk management agency. Regulators have a clearly defined regulatory role. Um, and sector risk management agencies now have a clearly defined support and development role. Sometimes they're the same. You can have elements that are. It's tough when you do that, but that it's not impossible. When I think about like the rail system, where the Transportation Security Agency is
Hmm.
does a lot of the regulating, but it also does the sector risk management role. It's done a good job improving the rail system. It still needs a lot of work. I don't want to go too far on that, but there's they've tried. We saw that in pipe. By the way, if you remember Colonial Pipeline,
Hmm.
there's 4 or 5 different federal agencies that felt they had a role in it. No one who wanted to say I was responsible. You know what I mean? It's two different things there. But we've got to get that. It needs to be clear what the lanes are. And I think in aviation is one of the best examples, where there's the FAA, the Federal
Hmm.
Aviation Administration, and the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. And they have roles. And in fact, at some points, I think TSA kind of regulates FAA, because FAA actually runs like our air traffic control system. And I'm always very uncomfortable with that. Blue on blue regulation, in other words, the government regulating itself. I don't know that we ever get like the public report, the bombshell report on that. never makes it out
Mhm,
because
mhm.
no administration is going to have one of its agencies rat out another one of its agencies publicly. So I'm a little uncomfortable with how that's doing. Whereas FAA would have no trouble and TSA would have no trouble ratting out the, Atlanta Hartsfield Operating Authority, for the aircraft, or Boeing Company. In fact, they do that pretty routinely. But you don't hear FAA say or TSA say, "Boy, FAA has a donkey of a air traffic control system," despite the fact we all know that FAA has a donkey of an air traffic control system with 25-year-old technology that when they
Yeah.
do upgrades, they have to call in retired, software engineers to help
Oh, yeah.
manage patching.
Yeah.
Please, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, but you don't hear any of that, and I got to be honest, you're never gonna. So my biggest concern is when they regulate each other, or when they're the
Mhm,
responsible for each other. But you're
mhm.
absolutely right to point out that whenever you have this is like having two parents, right? A kid can try one parent out, doesn't get the answer they want, they can try the other parent out, see what happens. So
That's
there's a little
right.
bit of that as well.
That's right. That's right. So should we move towards a model then when each sector is overseen by a dedicated risk management agency, or a model where CISA oversees each sector's risk management, or maintain the current hybrid model? I think you clearly said the current hybrid model leads to a lot of this going on.
Yeah, it
And
does.
so go ahead.
And you just added in a third ingredient, right, to the problem, which is SISA, and which is a good. SISA is a force for good, but having too many chefs in the kitchen can be a force for bad. But I will tell you, overall, SISA is a force for good. So you add SISA in, and SISA has a national risk management role.
Mhm.
And many of these things for smaller agencies, you can't duplicate it. So that if there's a responsible way to have CISA provide something to a sector in lieu of the sector risk management agency with the agreement of the sector risk management agency, I'm all for that. And there's a few examples of that, where CISA, particularly in like the threat notification, things like that. CISA does a pretty good job of reporting stuff directly into the Coast Guard system, which then gets pushed out to the maritime transportation sector companies. So we see some examples of it already, and more that should happen. So where CISA can provide a service to a federal agency, so the federal agency doesn't have to develop its own unique service, I'm for that if it's appropriate and it's scalable and tailorable, tailorable to the sector and scalable to the sector. Okay, so that's good. On the other hand, having CISA in there's a challenge. Now, where I think CISA gets in trouble a little bit is when they're the National Risk Management Agency for everyone. And NSM 22 made it clear that's their job. I think they called him a coordinator. Wish they'd called him a leader, but I got it. Where it hurt us a little bit was they didn't was that they CISA still has quite a few sectors for which is the sector risk management agency or the co-sector risk management agency. I wish there's a little trimming of those sales. And when I say
Mhm.
CISA, it's also DHS, which CISA is a part of, has some of those
Yes.
sectors as well.
Yeah.
I just hope that we can work on that a little bit and get that there. But let's be clear, CISA as the National Risk Management Agency is a win. It's in the end, you need to have one civilian defense, cyber defense agency, civilian
Mhm.
cyber defense agency. And to me, that's CISA. Just like DISA, the Defense Infrastructure Security Agency, is the military's cyber defense agency. I think we need a
Mhm.
CISA like this, and I'm excited at the leadership that Jen Easterly and her team have taken in this realm. But I wish they, had a more stable budget. I wish they had all the authorities for their aspirations. They have ideas that aren't yet authorized. We need to play catch up there and get that done. But overall, I'm okay with this hybrid model, mostly because it's eventually going to be a hybrid model with CISA.
Mhm. It's like matrix management.
Yeah.
So, last question, and this is a passion of mine. So it doesn't have critical infrastructure status, but what steps can really be taken to improve, support, and secure the U.S. cyber workforce, or similar areas that may be difficult to define or contain as a distinct sector?
Yeah. So look, yeah, probably a shame that I didn't say the word workforce across this whole thing, although I did mention low numbers in some of the agencies. Clearly, workforce is when you think about policy, which is what we've been talking about, technology and people are the three pillars that we build our cybersecurity on. People are clear. We know there's a shortfall. There's a shortfall in the federal government. There's a
Mhm.
shortfall in the public, infrastructure for cybersecurity talent. I'm not sure what the numbers are. I get a little worried with the heat map, saying it's 67.2% manned or something. I think that might be, a lot of variables in those numbers. I think in general, though, we're undermanned and we're consistently undermanned. We
Mhm.
just don't have enough women and men in these jobs. All right. How do we fix this? It's really a few things. One, we have to just, and I got to tell you, first, I want to acknowledge Harry Coker, the National Cyber Director,
Yes.
has really tackled this and made this a passion of his. And his team, led now by CU Maw and others there at the Office of National
Mhm.
Cyber Director, do a very good job on this. But the first we got to get the federal government right. There's a couple steps there. OPM has not, I think, over 20 years been the best steward of this effort. I think they're trying hard now, and probably need to get some kind of accepted service for cyber to recognize that it's not just an issue of money, but how you pick people, how you train them. Your more mid-grade people may not need an undergraduate degree like they do in many other areas of government service to be a GS 13 or 14. It might be that you need certain certificates and skills matched with mature experience. That gets you to GS 13, 14 as opposed to a bachelor's or master's degree. I think that's something OPM needs to work on. And then, of course, there will be special pay and special requirements that go into allowing that to happen. I know they're pushing legislation that I'm hoping Congress will take up, at least if not this year, then in the 119th Congress starting in 2025. That's number one. Number two is we've got to do a better job recruiting and onboarding personnel. We have an idea of a
Yeah.
workforce
Yes.
development institute that does that. That after you are accepted in USA Jobs and you're waiting 2 or 3 months or 4 months for your interim secret, the opportunity to take modules, get certificates, and get a higher step level when you join the government. In other words, you get rewarded for preparing yourself for government service, and you come in a full up round. DoD already does this in a couple areas, and it's worth mimicking. It also allows you to build your mid-grade force. So you're not cherry picking mid-grade personnel from other agencies. You can also train your HR talent management people here so they understand how to hire cybersecurity people. Hiring someone to a NIST NICE, that's the kind of terminology we use for the hiring standards in the federal agencies, to that kind of NIST NICE standard is hard. And if you're hiring food agriculture inspectors all day, you pick up a cyber, a job next. You need to have had some special training. We could do week-long modules there. Bottom line is, if we improve our onboarding, improve our retention efforts, we'll do better. I think the same is true in the private sector. We can do those. It's just an issue of scale there. It's an issue
Mhm.
of really getting the community colleges and the vocational schools, energized on this so that they're providing a lot of people with the right types of certificates and skills and internships so they can roll right into the workforce, as they leave vocational school or community college. So lots of opportunities there, Joyce. And I think all of those will contribute mightily to the security of our critical infrastructures.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mark. Where can our audience best collaborate with you and follow your exciting work?
So I think the best place is at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, www.fdd.org, and go into the Cyber Center on Technology and Innovation, or you can go to Cyber Solarium 2.0 at www.cybersolarium.org. That's where we're doing our work. And I just want to thank Joyce. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Mission Critical, because keeping our attention on critical infrastructure is a 24/7 requirement. It's not going away anytime
Yes.
soon. We have criminals out there. We have nation state actors out there. We know they're both working hard to kick our butts. So we have to work hard to build effective, resilient defenses that allow us to mitigate, prevent incidents, mitigate them when they happen, and recover rapidly after a failure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. How critical infrastructures are classified, secured, and discussed are at the core of Mission Critical. We are actually working on a book with CRC Press that showcases perspectives on critical infrastructure information security, and we're taking thoughts from academia, industry, and government. In addition to the 16 U.S. sectors, we are also going to include chapters that are focused on space, cyber workforce, election systems, education, state and local government. The book will also include sections focused on 14 critical and emerging technologies, ranging from quantum computing to artificial intelligence. That wraps it up for us today, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you at the next Critical Insights. Live long and prosper.